The war just 2 hours away leads to the understandable but also dangerous tendency to focus on European issues. To counter that tendency, we now want to broaden the lens and look eastward. Over the past decade, tensions in the Indo-Pacific have increased to an extent that have shifted international attention from cautious to concerned. Which leads to the overarching question for the upcoming panel, a fragile balance, peace and conflict in the Indo-Pacific. It is with great pleasure for me to introduce Lynn Kuok, who will moderate this panel. Lynn is Associate Fellow at IISS in London, and as Program Director of the Young Leaders Program at Körber-Stiftung, I also gladly mention that she is alumna of the Munich Young Leaders Program. Great to have you here, Lynn, and I'll ask you and your fantastic panel to the stage.
Hi, Akiko, Fukushima. Very nice meeting you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this room, and I thank the Körber-Stiftung for the opportunity to be here today with all of you. Elisa, thank you very much for that introduction. As Elisa mentioned, my name is Lynn Kuok, and I'm Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I'm based actually out of the Singapore office of the IISS. I'm very pleased today to be chairing this important session. The US National Security Strategy that was launched last week identified the Indo-Pacific as the epicenter of the 21st century geopolitics, and China, not Russia, as the pacing challenge as we move forwards. A little over 2 years ago, Germany, in recognition of the region's growing importance and challenges, launched its very own Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, expanding strategic partnerships and its own foreign and security presence in the region. Now, ever since these guidelines were launched, however, the security situation in the Indo-Pacific has deteriorated. The war in Europe reminds us that we cannot take peace for granted, and the so-called peace in the Indo-Pacific is nothing if not fragile. Now, I'm very pleased to be chairing this important session, and we will be seeking to examine first, the risk of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, second, the stakes of some of the major players in the region, the United States, Japan, and of course, Germany, the role we can expect each of these players to play, and this session will also, I hope, seek to examine whether and how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted a region that ostensibly seems far away, but really isn't when we think about how it all connects in a rules-based international order. Now, joining me in person to address these questions, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Franziska Brantner, of course, who needs no introduction in this circle. She's Parliamentary State Secretary, Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, Berlin, and Dr. Akiko Fukushima, who's Senior Fellow of the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research. Joining us virtually, I'm delighted to introduce my friend and former colleague at Yale Law School, Susan Thornton, Senior Fellow and Visiting Lecturer in Law at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center. Very warm welcome to you all. Thank you. Susan, perhaps we can start with you. Thank you for joining us so early in your morning. I think it's 5 a.m. where you are, but thank you. Yesterday, Secretary Blinken stated that China has made a decision to seize Taiwan on a much faster timeline than previously thought. While Secretary Blinken didn't elaborate on the timing, in March of last year, Admiral Phil Davidson, who was then commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that China wanted to take Taiwan during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years. So I think a much faster timeline would put us between now and 2027. Susan, what is your assessment of the risk of China taking Taiwan by force within this time frame?
Well, hi, Lynn, and thanks for having me here with all of you today. It's great to see you again. I mean, I think it's very important to remember that in the last sort of 6 years, 6 years ago, we were talking about the primary security challenge in Asia coming from North Korea. And that has dramatically changed, of course, in the intervening period. But I think with respect to Taiwan, it's also important to remember that between 2008 and 2016, we almost never discussed the issue of Taiwan in either US-China relations or in any other sort of global context where we were worried about security. So I think what is clear to me and should be clear to everyone is that the fact that we are now talking about Taiwan as a potential crisis is a function almost totally of the deterioration in US-China relations. And it's also, I think, important to note that the 2027 so-called time frame for China to take back Taiwan is something that has been articulated on the floor of the US Congress by Admiral Phil Davidson, as you mentioned. This idea of a timeline has come up in many, many speeches of US government officials, but it has not really come up at all in public from the Chinese government. And I think it is very important for audiences to recognize that the 2027 date comes from an estimation by the US government and the US military and by articulations from the Chinese about their military modernization, that they should be prepared and have the capability to take Taiwan by 2027. It hasn't been articulated by the Chinese as a take Taiwan date. It's been articulated by them as a military modernization goal deadline. So I think we have to try to reckon with the facts and look at what has actually happened here. I think this is sort of, objectively speaking, less about a Chinese timetable for taking Taiwan and more about, if we step back, you know, an issue of sort of the deterioration of US-China relations, as I said, but also a very complex mix of factors in the global environment. And I think we have to be you know, very careful. I think Tony Blinken also said yesterday that we are in a struggle for the post-Cold War order. I think what we want to make sure we don't do in that struggle is recreate the Cold War, and I have a sneaking suspicion and fear that that's where we're headed.
So the 2027 timeframe, if I understand you correctly, is more about capabilities rather than Chinese stated intentions. But of course, the argument by some analysts is that the only thing stopping China from taking Taiwan by force is capability. So is there any reason why we should be concerned that 2027 has been identified as the time frame within which China can be capable of taking Taiwan, given the linkage between capabilities and intentions by some analysts?
Yeah, well, my feeling is that the Chinese will not be triggered to take back Taiwan by a capabilities-based assessment. I think the trigger for Taiwan, given it's important to the Communist Party's legitimacy and even its importance to sort of the national identity and story of China, I think that the decision to take back Taiwan would be triggered by some kind of action to which the Chinese have to respond. Traditionally, we've thought of that as being a declaration of Taiwan independence or a move toward permanent separation from the mainland. And I think that that trigger would cause them to move in an aggressive way, whether they have reached the date of 2027 or not. In other words, I don't think the capabilities is the key factor in the decision-making about when to go and take Taiwan back.
Thank you, Susan. And I mean, last week, the United States launched its national security strategy, and in that national security strategy, it stated that it will prioritize maintaining an enduring competitive edge over the PRC while seeking to constrain a dangerous Russia. So the United States has prioritized China as the pacing threat. Do you think the administration has gotten it right in terms of how it has framed the challenge of China versus Russia? After all, we have analysts, for instance, Michael O'Hanlon at Brookings, I think where you are also a non-resident fellow, who pointed out that elevating China as the top national security concern seems incongruous, given that it is Russia that is waging a hot war, and it is Russia that is making nuclear threats.
Well, I think one thing that was in the national security strategy last week, which I appreciated finally seeing, was that there was sort of three areas, three pillars, if you will, of the national security strategy. One is obviously this effort to shore up our domestic competitiveness and resilience and, sort of overcome the recent years of sort of lack of investment and also some of our political dysfunction, and that's very important, clearly. The second pillar was this one about competition with geopolitical rivals, Russia and China. But the third leg of the stool, which has been very much attended to, I would say, in recent years, is the effort to work on these global issues, which are really now coming together and of great concern to all countries in the world. Things like climate change, pandemics, but also now you see problems with energy security, food security, equality, and economic development and overcoming poverty and other transnational issues like non-proliferation that are really probably a much greater threat to all of our populations, frankly, than China is. So I think the problem is, how are you going to devote your resources to these three major tasks and major challenges? And we've certainly seen a lot of devotion of resources to the China threat. I think that's what Michael O'Hanlon is talking about. Is this really the best way to organize ourselves and to tackle the very many challenges that we face now?
If we're talking about tackling shared transnational challenges, how optimistic are you that the US and China, given their intense geopolitical rivalry at the moment, are going to be able to tackle these shared challenges together? If we look at, the challenge that we've all faced over the last couple of years, the pandemic, that would seem to be the prime example, in a sense, of where they should be cooperating or should have cooperated, but did not. So how confident are you moving forwards that you will see, China, the United States, and even Russia work together on shared challenges?
Yeah, well, as a former diplomat, I mean, I consider it a colossal missed opportunity and actually a shame for the international system. The lack of cooperation and the active anti-cooperation that we saw for the pandemic, and it probably translated, frankly, to a lot of catastrophic damage in countries around the world. So I hope we don't see that again. But I have to say, it hasn't been very encouraging what we've seen about neither side being willing to sort of take the first step. There's a lot of pointing of fingers, blame game, and I don't see a lot of prospect in the US-China bilateral relationship for sort of overcoming the recent animosity and moving on a more constructive path. I'm hopeful that maybe some other countries would be instrumental in sort of pushing them together, but so far we really haven't seen that.
Thank you, Susan. Perhaps now I could move to State Secretary Brantner. The German Indo-Pacific policy guidelines spell out a plethora of German interests in the Indo-Pacific. It lists 8, but these range from peace and security to open markets and free trade to access to fact-based information. Quite a few interests were mentioned. In terms of prioritization of these interests, what would you say are German priorities in the Indo-Pacific? And where do these priorities stand in terms of its interests closer to home, particularly given the war in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much. And by the way, it's one of my first security panels, all female, but it's lovely. and on a hard issue. So I'm delighted that you say that we talk about interest in that region, also vis-à-vis China, because my impression is that sometimes some would like to frame the debate that it's one between values and, on the other side, interests. But it really is not. It's about interests. And it's in our interest that we do keep our economic, strength, that we protect our infrastructure, and that we protect and help and work together with our allies and partners. And that's why we need to work on decreasing dependencies, and that's why we need to make sure that the signal of Ukraine is not, you can invade another country and get away with it. And that's why I think, the regions are linked. It's not as if what we do today in Ukraine has no implications for what is happening in other regions of the world. I think it's very closely watched. And in that sense, I think, it's good that we discuss, and of course we have other economic interests in the region, economic interests in China. We should be very open about it. And the question is how we will balance these interests. And it's a tough discussion, which is going on right now in Germany, and I just hope that we'll be able to take not just a very short-term perspective on this, but are able to project our interests in the near and further future. And having said that, climate will be an issue for the entire region, and it's a key one to work with countries also like Indonesia, other countries, Vietnam, etc., where we have very intense negotiations now on climate energy partnerships, etc. So that is an incentive. We also would like to keep working with China, of course, on the climate questions. China is very heavily hit, but so is Pakistan and other countries in the region. For me, it's actually very painful to see the impacts of the crisis already these days. So this is an issue we would like to address with all of them, and some of them will have a very strong partnership and cooperation with.
Thank you for clearly setting out Germany's interests and priorities in the Indo-Pacific. So if I heard you correctly, it would be protection of infrastructure, supporting of allies and partners, the important signal that what happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for the broader implications for a rules-based order, your economic interest there as well as climate change. Your ally and partner, the United States, has also talked about how it would like to see European allies and partners playing a more active role in the Indo-Pacific, and in a sense that matches your interests and US desires also match in that respect. The US has said in terms of the areas it would like European allies and partners to focus on, it has highlighted supporting freedom of navigation as well as maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Does Germany or Europe more generally have the capacity, particularly given events in Europe, to play a more active security role in the region?
We have already become more active. So it's not just about the future, but it's already what's going on. And of course, it's one of the areas where the Ministry of Defense is closely looking at. Minister of Foreign Affairs, she was here earlier this morning. What we do from our ministry is, of course, to work on decreasing dependencies. And we have in some areas over-dependencies, and it relates to imports and exports. And I think we see these days how important the instrumentalization, some call it weaponization, but certainly instrumentalization of economic ties are. And we also see that if we want to diversify, then we have to work with the entire region. And it's interesting to see that many now do restart rethinking our relationships with countries which, sometimes are a bit more complicated for investments, but are still very worthwhile in big markets. And hopefully we can work on this together to diversify imports and exports. But it's nothing that will happen from today till tomorrow. It's quite a steady process, and it will take time. And in the meantime, of course, we need to work on all the other issues as well. But I'm quite confident that we will not do this alone as Germans, but hopefully as Europeans, because for me, it makes no sense to have this as a purely national approach, but we really need to make this a European policy. And only then, I think, can we be successful and make a difference.
Yes, and of course, I mean, I come from that part of the world, and I think German engagement, European engagement, especially in the economic realm, is very much appreciated, because it can't only be about abstract talk about a rules-based order if the countries in the region do not have the means by which they can support themselves and to make free choices as sovereign states. So I think that part of Germany and Europe's engagement is very important. But there's also the other part about security engagement. Do you think we're likely to see more German security engagement in the region? We had the Bayern, of course, sail through the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific region in 2021. There was talk about whether or not the next deployment would be within 3 or 2 years. There's also been talk about whether or not that really makes a difference. But I think the fact of the matter is that it demonstrates, at least symbolically, and symbols do matter, that more countries than just the United States care about a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So can we expect to see more security engagement from Germany or the European, or Europe more generally? Let's talk about Germany.
I think you raised a fair point in terms of what is the real difference and what is the difference in signaling attachment and commitment to the region. And I think the later part we will certainly be able to respond. On the first part, I think we still heavily rely on the US, let's put it out bluntly. But I think it's still important that we increase our commitments, and as you said, it's also important, even if it never comes close to what the US is playing as a role in that region, but it signals that for us the region is important and it keeps being important. So it's in between these two, so how large will it be, but it will certainly not be less.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit earlier about the deteriorating situation in the Taiwan Strait. How might Germany respond in the event of an escalation in the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, that's the $1 billion question. I hope that everything that we do now is making this impossible. But I also think that, as you said, we have to take the threat serious, but also be careful about not making them happening by talking about it all the time. So there's this in between, I think, taking it serious, keeping up our very good relationship and improving it with Taiwan, signaling that this is important to us. And at the same time, I think we have now all the responsibility to make sure Ukraine will be a good test case in terms of what happens to you if you invade a country, a sovereign state. So I think that's sort of our now large responsibility, and on the other side, to work on our economic vulnerability and decrease it as far and as fast as we can.
Thank you. Akiko, perhaps I could move to you. So talking about Ukraine, your Prime Minister at the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Ministers meeting held in Singapore earlier this year said that he had a real sense of urgency that what is happening in Ukraine may be East Asia tomorrow. So his words were, Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. Do you think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has increased the risk of war in East Asia in general, or Taiwan more specifically? Why or why not? What are the right parallels that we should be drawing from Ukraine in East Asia?
Thank you. Let me share my perspective based in Tokyo as an academic, and the neighborhood is getting more tense, and we are concerned. And Prime Minister Kishida at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, as well as at NATO plus AP4 summit in June, he said Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. And that shows concerns that we share in East Asia or in Japan as well. Franziska has mentioned about we linked in terms of concerns as well as interests. And I do agree with you. And rather than exact parallel, Russian aggression against Ukraine has made many of the changes underway more visible and perhaps more accelerated in Indo-Pacific. And people are very much concerned. And as a reflection of that sense, Japan has joined the G7 in imposing sanctions on Russia despite our ongoing northern territorial negotiations with Moscow and despite our heavy energy dependence on Russia, particularly natural gas from Ukraine. And I think it is important for us to sustain our functions against Russia to show that we are not accepting actions taken by Russia against Ukraine. That's how we perceive it. And therefore, we are trying to enhance our cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. As you might recall, former Prime Minister Abe originated this concept in 2007 when he spoke at Indian Parliament that two oceans, Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans, are confluenced, and therefore we have to look at it. And in 2016, Japan announced its Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, abbreviated as FOIP. Since then, Japanese FOIP has evolved over the years, as illustrated in the terminology. We started from Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, and then to Vision, and now it is simply Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Nevertheless, the concept we have in our FOIP hasn't changed. It has been very consistent, and we try to protect the rule of law, freedom, and other values that we share. It is very important for us to garner peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. And in that sense, Japan appreciated German initiative in launching the policy guidelines on Indo-Pacific, and your implementation, which was reflected in the progress report announced last September. We also appreciated actions taken by Germany. As you have, both of you have mentioned, Germany has sent its frigate, Violent, to the Indo-Pacific. And in addition, this summer, German Air Force joined Pitch Black, which is multinational drill in Australia, and Japan has participated. And on their return, some of your Eurofighters made a visit to Japan, and Lieutenant General Gerhardt piloted Eurofighter to Japan, while Lieutenant General Izutsu of Japan Self-Defense Forces Air Force piloted F-2. And they, flying over Japanese skies together in a formation flight, showed solidarity that we have. And these examples would show solidarity that we have among partners and like-minded countries, which should be helpful. But I wouldn't say this is the end of the story. As you pointed out, there are multiple factors that we have to look at, including economic security, which you are more versed than I am.
You're inspiring us in Japan, by the way, on economic security, if I may say so.
Well, thank you. Well, we just passed the economic security promotion law, and we have started to implement it. Yeah. And that should enhance our resilience, I believe, and that's something very important. There are other multiple factors, but I'll leave it to other questions.
I mean, I'd like to come to economic security and economic engagement later, because Japan has really, in a sense, been the leader in that respect, at least in the Indo-Pacific. But I think I was alluding to the fact that many analysts, and also perhaps some of your leaders, have made that connection between what's happening in Ukraine and Russia's actions and what might happen in East Asia. So does the war in Ukraine, in a sense, increase the propensity perhaps for China to take action against Taiwan? Do you think that that's a real risk, or do you think some of this, do you think the slogan, Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, is a bit overblown?
Well, that may be too simplified as an expression. Let me explain. Mr. Xi Jinping, was it 2 days ago at 20th Party Congress, gave a speech, and he said in English translation, does not rule out unification by force. And that is, of course, a concern. But before taking such an outright action, China may employ more sophisticated approaches on the question of Taiwan. And there are many ways that Japan and its allies and partners can work together. However, do you know how far Taiwan Strait is from Japanese archipelago?
86 miles.
It's 110 kilometers from westmost island of Japanese archipelago by the name of Yonaguni. So any actions around the Taiwan Strait concerns us. For example, in August, China conducted a military drill, and 5 of 9 missiles launched around Taiwan landed in the exclusive economic zone of Japan. And of course, it concerned Japan as well as the safety of its people in the vicinity. So we are very much concerned. But policies we should take, and we are very much concerned, therefore it is reflected, Susan, in our summit meetings since April 2021 that has alluded to a specific peace and stability of Taiwan, as well as 2+2s on peace and stability of Taiwan Straits. So we are very much concerned, but measures we should take should be more versatile rather than just focusing on that.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that measures Japan should take should be more versatile, what do you think Japan might do in the event of a Taiwan contingency to pose the $1 billion question again twice so that we get $2 billion?
The $2 billion question is too tough. However, it's not something else in fantasy, but something that we are very concerned. Therefore, Japan and the United States are discussing how we can enhance our preparedness and how we can deter such eventuality by our cooperation. So there are, and Japan, well, United States has announced its national security strategy. Japan is going to announce its national security strategy, revised one from 2013 by the end of the year, as well as we'll announce our defense strategy at the same time, including midterm plan. And through those, we would like to be prepared better. But at the same time, we would like to engage China as well for economic discussions or discussions of global issues like climate change or others, which we need to work together, and that should be interest of all of us. So we are going to take versatile approaches to the question. That's how I understand it.
But last year, I think, and I'm not sure whether this year as well, several senior Japanese politicians have appeared to commit Japan to defending Taiwan if China attacks. Were these just misreporting in the media? Do you think that it's not going to be so simplistic where China attacks Taiwan, Japan takes action, or given that Japan has clear and present interest in the Taiwan Straits, would it be that simple? China attacks Taiwan, Japan comes to the aid of the United States.
Well, I'm afraid that is not that simple. And as you know, we have Article 9 of Japanese Constitution, and what we can do has certain constraints. But there are a variety of things we can do in case of contingency, like logistical support to U.S. forces and other allies. But other than that, there are so many things that we can do to deter or to prevent such contingency happening in Taiwan Strait. As we have learned in the case of Russian aggression to Ukraine, if we can prevent such contingency, we are all much better. And that's something I personally would like to see. There are people who are talking about that, but in talking such eventuality, we have to think more. And as a matter of fact, in summer, a private think tank in Japan hosted a tabletop simulation exercise for Taiwan contingency. And that has uncovered many of the things that we have to work out in facing such contingency to take place. And if I may repeat, we should try to prevent that to happen.
Thank you. You know, we talked a lot about economic engagement and its importance there. The United States, of course, in Japan in May, actually launched its Indo-Pacific economic framework. How would you assess the U.S. Indo-Pacific economic framework, and do you think that goes far enough to secure the U.S. and other interests in the Indo-Pacific and supporting the rules-based international order, given that it's not necessarily the most attractive of economic deals compared to, say, the TPP, given that it seeks to impose labor and environmental standards on some of these countries who might not be well-equipped to meet those standards, while at the same time not providing market access to the lucrative United States market?
Well, Japan has taken the lead in the negotiation of CPTPP, and I personally would like to see United States back in TPP, but I also understand that it is difficult for the United States to return to that agreement. And having witnessed the difficulty, I welcome the initiative on Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, because that tries to set the rules for our economic activities, and it is very important for us to have rules and important for us to implement rules, because if we end up having plural rules-based order of liking of different groups, that's going to be very, very difficult. At this time, I'm afraid I'm witnessing the division of the world, maybe into three groups. One led by US and Europe, and others, including Japan, and the other group led by China and Russia and its supporters, and the middle is middle ground states. If we end up having plural rules, rules do not lead to the rules-based order. In a sport, if we play by different rules, if we do not play by common rules, games are not fun. Games do not stand. For example, baseball fields and softball fields look similar, but they cannot play together because their rules are very, very different. So it is very important to have common rules. But in developing economic framework, I do not know the details yet. So I would like to read the details as people negotiate Indo-Pacific economic framework. But maybe we can take a flexible approach and include market access, but those countries who would like to join that clause can join, and US may be able to decide whether they would like to come back. But market access is very important for Indo-Pacific countries. Many colleagues in the region told me that market access is very important. That's how I perceive it.
Thank you. Just one last question for Susan before we open the floor to questions. You mentioned, the world being divided into different groups, and I think that's been quite apparent to me, this bifurcation or trifurcation of the world, in a sense, between authoritarian states versus democracies, and this is the framing that the Biden administration, and before that, perhaps the Trump administration, adopted, but it's really become more pronounced in the last year or so in the Biden administration. And of course, President Biden has talked about the dangers that authoritarian states have posed to democracies around the world. Susan, in the national security strategy that was launched last week, do you see a sort of softening of that language, or a softening or more nuanced approach being taken by the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, I think we definitely did see Jake Sullivan address this in his rollout of the national security strategy, and clearly he tried to soften it or walk it back or make it more flexible. So I think, it's proving difficult to have a comprehensive foreign policy and remain as the leader of the international system while trying to sort of divide the world and put so-called authoritarian countries into sort of a timeout or outcasting them. And we've seen this in the past, and I think sort of the reality of this policy is kind of coming home, and we're trying to sort of sort through whether there are some modifications that can be made to this. But you do see President Biden coming back to it again and again, and I have to say I think this is a reflection of the fact that this initially President Biden raising this notion of democracy versus autocracy was more of a reflection about problems at home than it necessarily even was about sort of the problems we faced out in the global context. So I don't know how it will go forward, but I do see the sort of national security staff continually trying to sort of make it more flexible, and sometimes President Biden doesn't sound quite the same as terms of his moderating.
Exactly, and I must say that as someone coming from the part of the world that some of these strategies are directed towards, I've been quite relieved to see a softening of that language, given how it unnecessarily deepens divisions between countries like China on the one hand and the United States on the other, and it potentially alienates potential partners in the region as well. So I think that was a good step forward in terms of the national security strategy. Now, I'd like to open the floor up to questions. So if you could just raise your hands. I already see one over there. Perhaps after I identify you, you could identify yourself, where you come from, and to whom your question is addressed. Thank you. Please, sir.
Good morning, Jonas Brother-Plesner. I'm the Executive Director at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, based in Copenhagen, with the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. My question to my old friend Susan from DC, good to see you, would be on Taiwan. First, I actually want to take issue when you say Beijing taking back Taiwan. The People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, has never ruled over Taiwan, and nor should they, in my point of view. Taiwan is a sort of self-governing democratic society that we should defend. So, but my question would be on what kind of deterrent, if you were back in the administration, would you want to see the administration enact for Beijing not taking Taiwan, both on the economic and military front? To Franziska Brantner, a question on economic deterrence and China. 10 years ago, in 2012, co-authored an op-ed and report with the European Council on Foreign Relations on Beijing, China, and beware of what the strategic dependency economic would mean further down the road. That's where we are now, further down the road. The economic dependency is really large. So you mentioned it would take time. You mentioned it has to be done in European context. So I wanted you to be a bit more concrete on sort of what steps you would take, both from the government, of course. I know you have to work with businesses to get this sort of diversification happening, but also how it could be used for economic deterrence of China. Should this be out public for not attacking Taiwan, of saying this would lead in the same way as with Russia to cutting ties, and your thoughts on that? Thank you.
And we had some questions over there, the lady over there.
Open Society.
Just 1 second. I think another microphone is coming your way.
It's out of battery. Thank you. Heather Gravy from Open Society. Following on from Jonas's question, we have a very specific and strategic dependency on China for our energy transition. China controls 90% of the critical raw materials for making the renewables technologies which we need for our own decarbonization in Europe, as well as China needs them for its own decarbonization. And our solar panel industry moved to China some time ago. Our wind industry is also being attracted to the US because of the IRA and so on. I'm really curious about your views on whether it makes sense to think of renewables as a strategic interest of the European Union because it's an industry, it needs to be subjected to the usual competition policy, trade policy, and so on. And yet it's something that is urgently needed for us and also to reduce our emissions for the world. So what's the solution with China? Obviously, we don't want trade measures to deter Chinese exports to Europe, and yet the supply is controlled, and also the capacity to increase our own manufacturing here in Europe is quite limited. So glad of your views on how climate, trade, geostrategic interests and the EU-US relationship collide over that issue.
The gentleman at the back, and then the lady actually to the right of
Thank you. I'm the representative of Quasi-Chapter of Taiwan here in Germany. One of the questions I wanted to raise was already talked about. I want to say it's quite interesting and unusual that Ms. Thornton used 3 times the phrase take over, while Ms. Lynn used take action too, and Ms. Fukushima used, I think, cited what Joe Biden has said, if China attacks, only Ms. Thornton used take back. You cannot take back what has never belonged to you. The People's Republic of China has never governed Taiwan for even one day. Taiwan is a democracy. The second question I want to raise is, I want to know why Ms. Thornton, according to my understanding, played down the role of Taiwan. Taiwan, USA and China, the conflict between USA and China is not because Taiwan needs support from Japan or USA. The reason why USA, the other countries support Taiwan is because Taiwan is important. I think you have known that General MacArthur wrote a memorandum to his president, President Truman, in, I think it was on the 14th June 1950. And in that memorandum, General MacArthur pointed out, should Taiwan become a part of China, should Taiwan be taken over by China, by the communist China or Russian, Taiwan would become an unthinkable aircraft carrier and the tender of submarines. That warning 70 years ago has been now a truth again, and that's the reason why China wants to take over Taiwan, not to take back Taiwan, and that reason why this Indo-Pacific strategic alliance, Japan and USA, Australia, and France and Germany and USA too. That means I think it would be a fatal mistake to divide Taiwan from this concept, Indo-Pacific Strategic Alliance. TSMC means not only Taiwan Semiconductor Project. The question is, why is he taking over 3 times and play down the role of Taiwan? I don't think that should be accepted. Thank you.
More comments. So the last question goes to the lady, I think a few seats in front, and then we will turn to our panelists for responses.
Can I go first? Excuse me. Thank you very much. Claudia Brickman from the Federal Foreign Office. I'll make it real quick. Maybe a question to the think tank experts on the panel. We heard in the news that Chancellor Scholz is planning to visit China in November. What would be your opinion on this, and what would be your expectations to this visit? Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
It was about the trip to China.
Exactly, yeah.
Franziska, you need to go soon, so could you take the questions? I think you had a question on economic dependency and the steps to take, and renewables, whether it should be a strategic interest of the EU, and the last question, if you wanted to address that as well.
Yes, thank you. I take the first question when it came to decreasing dependencies, investing in our own supply chains. Of course, it's companies doing it. We are a free market liberal democracy, and I'm not deciding where each company is buying, etc. Like, we are working on a European due diligence concept where companies have to show that they're not based in terms of on forced labor, slavery, etc. So, but at the same time, it's really mainly companies, and I always remind them that one of the first lessons you usually learn in business class is risk management. It's actually quite interesting to see that the American rating agencies might be the largest mover on this, because they're now including a geopolitical risk assessment. And it might become just very expensive for European companies to refinance themselves if they don't diversify. So maybe that might be the largest incentive. We will support where we can, but I really want to underline that in the end, it's companies' decision to diversify. The European Commission will come up with a proposal at the beginning of next year on the Raw Material Act, and I really think it's right to do this at the European level. I don't want it to happen that now we as Germans rush to get the lithium, we as Germans rush to get ABC, and then everybody else will say, so what do we get? So I think it's right to do this in a European framework. Germany and France, we did have a joint proposal to the Commission of saying, let's make it an active raw material policy, because there's still some debate within the EU Commission on how active it should be. And Japan has been mentioned, South Korea is another good example, Australia. So I think, we have to move into that direction. But let's see what the EU Commission will propose. And it's certain that we have to work on urban mining, recycling, circular economy. It is just not acceptable how uncareful we are with the resources we have in our territories already. If you know the dependencies on importing them, it's quite incredible that we do not trade that better. And second point, if I may, on the solar energy, we are importing from China. We almost have no more solar really production. There were sanctions until 2018, of course, because there's hyper subsidies, and now we almost have no more producers here. And then we have the Americans now with the Inflation Reduction Act that are building up their own industry, not just on solar, but also on hydrogen, on batteries, etc. And I can totally see the intention of the Americans. It's wonderful for the climate, it's good for diversification, but they really should involve their partners too. Because they don't, Japanese don't have access, Germans don't have access. And it doesn't make this purposeful, I think, in terms of making it a joint transformation. I would like, probably the law will not be touched. It was hard enough to get it off the ground. But there are still a lot of questions around implementation. And I would like to make this a constructive appeal to our American colleagues to say, let's work together on diversification, we will do our homework, but let's be part of a joint market. And let's not have it just Mexico, US, Canada, which will exclude so many of your partners in Asia, in Europe, and which will, I think, in the long term harm both objectives, climate protection and resilience. So, this will be tough negotiations over the next couple of weeks, months, but I think we have to do it in a constructive approach of saying, we know this is the homework we have to do, we are ready to do it, but let's do it together.
Thank you so much, Franziska, and thank you for joining the panel.
Thank you.
I'll just move on to ask Akiko. I don't think there were any questions that were directed at you specifically, but if you had anything to address, maybe just a brief note, and then after that we'll move on to Susan to close. I think you had a question, Susan, on deterrence as well as the kind of deterrence you'd like to see, and if you wanted to touch on the question of Taiwan, we could have you do that as well. So Akiko, any final comments, perhaps not even on the questions itself?
I would like to be very brief. Indo-Pacific is a unique regional concept that involves not only resident actors, but other actors beyond geographical borderline. And that is something very new, and that's something we should take full advantage of. And in that Indo-Pacific, it is important for us to deter as well as engage. If we cannot do both and still resilient, it is very difficult for us to gain peace. That's something we have learned from our recent experience. And regional cooperation in Indo-Pacific is different from Europe in a sense that we do not have collective architecture for cooperation, but our multiplexed cooperation architecture is not a spaghetti ball as once dubbed, but more of a lasagna to combine bilateral, minilateral, multilateral cooperation together for the purpose of peace and stability and prosperity. That's something I would like to leave with you.
Thank you. The importance of deterrence as well as engagement. Susan, though, you had a question on deterrence, please.
Yeah, I mean, first let me say, Lynn, I don't think I ever said anything about that Taiwan was not important to the United States. I mean, our policy is for peaceful resolution and prolongation of the status quo. And I think that what I said was that the tensions that we currently see in the Taiwan Strait are mainly a function of the deterioration of U.S.-China relations. And I think it's quite clear because we didn't have tensions in the Taiwan Strait prior to the deterioration of U.S.-China relations. And we had, Xi Jinping was in office. We had even President Tsai was in office. And it's really started to deteriorate only in the last couple of years as far as the tensions and escalation and discussion of military conflict in the Strait. So I think I want to be clear on that it has nothing to do with Taiwan's importance, which I support and, of course, endorse. As far as deterrence goes, I'm quite alarmed that the only thing I hear people talking about in terms of preventing military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is military deterrence. Because as I mentioned in my remarks, I don't think that that is the only consideration or even the key consideration for the Chinese when they consider making a move on Taiwan. And I don't want to get into the discussion about reunification, unification, et cetera. There's a whole academic discussion going on about this, but I think U.S. policy is very clear based on the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. So, a discussion of whether Taiwan would be reunified or unified is not really germane to the current set of tensions, I think. And that's what we're really focused on because, frankly, Taiwan would be the biggest loser in any conflict. I think the damage from a Taiwan conflict would incur mainly on Taiwan and China. So I think, we have to consider that we want this, of course, to be avoided as it would affect every country in the world. And I think we need to focus more on prolonging the timeline, making sure that we're not accelerating China's consideration of having to use military force. And I think in that respect, we're not paying enough attention to things that we are doing that may be accelerating their timeline. And I think in combination with military deterrence, we have to think about that. Military deterrence is very important, but it is not the only thing. And military deterrence alone is it would be dangerous. I mean, it would probably be more of an accelerant than anything else in this situation if it's not balanced by other measures that could be taken to sort of make sure that we don't see continuing escalation of tensions across the Strait.
Thank you. We've unfortunately come to the end of this session. Thank you all for your attention and your questions. Please join me as well in thanking my excellent panelists, Franziska, who's left us, Akiko, as well as Susan.